Imagine coming home after an ordinary evening and expecting to see your wife and children. Instead, you open your garage door and discover that your entire family has been shot. And before you have even had time to understand what you were looking at, the people you once trusted to protect you begin wondering whether you were the one who did it. That was the nightmare David Camm walked into on September 28, 2000. David Camm was a former Indiana State Police trooper living in Georgetown, Indiana, with his wife, Kimberly, and their two children, 7-year-old Brad and 5-year-old Jill. He had spent more than a decade in law enforcement, and on that September evening, he had been playing basketball with friends at a nearby church. Nothing about the night was supposed to become history. David finished playing basketball and headed home. When he arrived, he discovered something was terribly wrong. His family was dead. Kimberly had been shot. Brad had been shot. Jill had been shot. David called his former Indiana State Police post and reported that he had found his family murdered. The call triggered an emergency response, and within minutes, the quiet Indiana neighborhood was filled with police vehicles, flashing lights, investigators, and the chaos that follows a triple homicide. But the most important part of the story was not simply that 3 people had been murdered. It was what happened next. David was not treated only as a grieving husband and father. Investigators began looking at him as a possible suspect, and that decision would eventually transform one family tragedy into one of the most complicated wrongful conviction cases in Indiana history. Because once investigators began focusing on David, almost every piece of evidence seemed to be interpreted through the same question: could David Camm have killed his own family? David insisted that he had been playing basketball that evening and that other people could account for his whereabouts. He had witnesses who said he was at the gym. But the prosecution would later argue that his alibi did not necessarily make him innocent. The investigation was now moving in a dangerous direction. A husband had lost his wife. A father had lost his children. And instead of simply asking who had entered the Camm home, investigators increasingly focused on whether David himself had somehow created the scene. Then investigators found something on David's shirt. Tiny bloodstains. They were small, almost insignificant to the naked eye. But those tiny stains would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. Prosecutors would eventually argue that the stains were created when David was close to the victims as they were being shot. If that interpretation was correct, it could destroy his alibi. But if the interpretation was wrong, an innocent man's life could be changed forever. And that was only the beginning. Because the blood on David's shirt was about to become the centerpiece of a case that would send him to prison. Not once, but twice. And years later, another piece of evidence, sitting in an evidence room almost unnoticed, would point investigators toward a completely different man. A sweatshirt, a strange nickname, and DNA that had been sitting in the case file for years. But first, David Camm would have to survive the first trial. And the evidence prosecutors believed would prove he was a murderer was about to become the beginning of his 13-year fight for freedom. The first major battle in the David Camm case was not fought over a confession. There was no murder weapon found in David's possession. There was no eyewitness who watched David shoot his family. Instead, prosecutors leaned heavily on something much smaller: bloodstains. David had been wearing a t-shirt when he discovered his family. Investigators noticed several tiny bloodstains on the shirt. A prosecution bloodstain analyst, Robert Stites, interpreted those stains as high-velocity impact spatter. Evidence that prosecutors argued was consistent with someone being close to a shooting. The implication was devastating. If the stains had been created by the gunfire, then David's story about discovering his family after returning from basketball could be seriously undermined. The blood evidence became a central part of the probable cause case against him and later played an important role at trial. Court records and later proceedings would reveal serious problems surrounding Stites' qualifications and testimony. But the defense offered a completely different explanation. David said that after finding his family, he had tried to help his son. He had touched and moved Brad while desperately trying to determine whether the boy was still alive. The defense argued that the tiny stains on David's shirt could have been transferred to the fabric during that frantic attempt to help his child. That distinction was everything. One interpretation suggested David had been close to a shooting. The other suggested he had been a grieving father trying to save his son. The jury had to decide which explanation made more sense. But the prosecution was not relying only on blood. They also developed a theory about David's possible motive. They argued that his marriage was troubled and that financial and personal issues could have provided a reason for him to want his wife dead. The case was becoming a battle between two completely different stories. The defense said David was a devastated father who had come home from basketball and discovered a massacre. The prosecution said the same man was hiding behind the image of a grieving husband. And then came the courtroom. In 2002, David Camm went on trial for the murders of his wife and 2 children. The prosecution presented the blood evidence. The defense challenged the interpretation. The jury heard competing explanations for the stains. But there was another problem for David. The trial also included highly prejudicial evidence about his personal life. Later, an appellate court concluded that certain evidence about alleged affairs had unfairly prejudiced the jury. The jury nevertheless convicted him. David Camm was sentenced to 3 life sentences. For prosecutors, the case appeared solved. For David, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last more than a decade. He had lost his wife, he had lost his children, and now he had lost his freedom. But something else had happened during the investigation. Something investigators had already seen. Something that had already been tested for DNA. Something that had been sitting near the body of his son. A sweatshirt. At the time, it did not seem important enough to change the case. But that sweatshirt was about to become the most dangerous piece of evidence in the prosecution's story. Because whoever had worn it had left behind something that could not be explained away by a theory. They had left their DNA. David Camm was now in prison. For a man who had spent years working in law enforcement, prison represented the complete reversal of his former life. He had once been the person standing on the other side of the cell door. Now he was the one behind it. But David refused to accept that his story was over. He continued fighting his conviction through the courts. Meanwhile, the physical evidence from the crime scene remained. And among that evidence was a gray sweatshirt. It had been found at the crime scene near Brad Camm's body. The sweatshirt did not belong to David Camm, and DNA recovered from it did not match David. That alone should have raised an obvious question. If David did not own the sweatshirt, who did? The evidence contained another strange clue. Inside the sweatshirt was a nickname associated with its owner, not Clee 2, as some retellings of the case have claimed. The documented nickname connected to the sweatshirt was Backbone, and eventually that nickname would lead investigators to a man named Charles Boney. But at the time of the original investigation, the DNA profile did not immediately produce a known suspect. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, prosecutors later claimed the DNA profile had been submitted to the FBI database without a match, while evidence showed the profile had not actually been submitted to the FBI database at that time. That distinction is crucial, because the mystery was not simply that police found DNA and couldn't identify it. The deeper issue was whether the unidentified DNA had been fully pursued. For years, David remained behind bars while his legal team continued examining the evidence. Then, the case began to change. David's first conviction was overturned by the Indiana Court of Appeals in 2004 after the court found that prejudicial evidence had been improperly introduced at his trial. That meant David would get another chance in court. But the second trial would not be a simple replay of the first, because now there was a new name, Charles Boney. Boney was a convicted felon with a criminal history that made investigators take a very different look at the sweatshirt. Police questioned him. Boney admitted that the sweatshirt had belonged to him, although he claimed he had given it away before the murders. Then, investigators found another connection. A palm print recovered from the family's vehicle was matched to Boney. Now, the strange sweatshirt was no longer just an unexplained piece of clothing. It was connected to a real person who had been in contact with the family's vehicle, and whose DNA was associated with the sweatshirt found at the crime scene. For David's defense team, this changed everything, because the question was no longer simply, did David kill his family? Now, there was another question that the prosecution had to answer. Why was Charles Boney's DNA associated with evidence from the murder scene? And the answer would lead directly into David Camm's second trial. When investigators connected the sweatshirt to Charles Boney, the case took a dramatic turn. Boney was no longer just a name. He was a real person with a criminal history, a connection to the sweatshirt, and a palm print that investigators linked to the Camm family's vehicle. The defense argued that this evidence pointed toward Boney as the person who had entered the scene. But prosecutors did not simply abandon their case against David. Instead, the prosecution developed a new theory. According to the new theory, David Camm and Charles Boney were connected. Boney would eventually claim that he had been involved in a plan with David. He said David had approached him about killing his family. This was a dramatic change. The first case had essentially centered on the idea that David himself had killed his family. Now the prosecution had another explanation. David had supposedly arranged for another man to help him. It was a new theory built around the same defendant. And now Charles Boney was in a position to testify. Boney became a key prosecution witness. but his story would have to survive cross-examination. The defense wanted to know something very simple. If David and Boney had really planned the murders together, where was the evidence of their relationship? Where were the calls? Where were the meetings? Where was the money? Where was the physical evidence showing that these two men had planned a murder together? Boney's account became the centerpiece of a second prosecution theory, and the defense attacked it piece by piece. The case had now become much more complicated than a simple murder trial. There was a dead family. There was a convicted former police officer. There was a second man connected to crime scene evidence. There was DNA. There was a sweatshirt. There was a palm print. There were competing forensic interpretations. And there were two completely different explanations for what had happened inside the Cam family's garage. The prosecution wanted the jury to believe that David had used Boney as an accomplice. The defense wanted the jury to believe that Boney's presence at the crime scene was evidence that investigators had originally focused on the wrong man. But there was another problem. The second trial was taking place after years of publicity. David had already been convicted once. The public had already heard the story. He was no longer simply a suspect. To many people, he was already the man who had killed his wife and children. And that is one of the most powerful forces in a criminal case. Once a story becomes familiar, people can begin treating the story as fact before the evidence has been fully reconsidered. The second trial would test whether the new evidence was enough to break through that perception. It wasn't. In 2006, David Cam was convicted again and sentenced to life without parole. Charles Boney was also convicted. David was going back to prison again. He had now been convicted twice for the same murders, and yet the case was still not finished, because the legal system had not yet answered a fundamental question. Had David received a fair trial? The answer would come from Indiana's highest court, and when it did, David's second conviction would collapse. For most people, being convicted of a crime once would be enough to destroy everything. David Cam had now been convicted twice. The first conviction had been overturned. The second conviction had put him back in prison, but his legal team kept fighting. In 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned the second conviction and ordered another trial. The court concluded that prejudicial evidence concerning an allegation that David had sexually molested his daughter had improperly affected the fairness of the trial. David had never been charged with that allegation. Now David faced something almost unimaginable: a third trial, same defendant, same murders, same dead family, but a completely different courtroom battle. And this time, the defense had years of accumulated evidence to work with. The third trial would not simply ask whether David's original story was believable. It would ask whether the prosecution's entire case could survive a much deeper examination of the forensic evidence. The bloodstains on David's shirt would come back under the microscope. The sweatshirt would become important again. Charles Boney would again be part of the story, and experts would challenge the interpretation of the physical evidence. The bloodstain evidence was especially important because it had helped prosecutors build their original case. At the first trials, the prosecution's interpretation was that the stains were consistent with high-velocity impact spatter. But by the third trial, the defense was able to present competing forensic analysis. The defense argued that the stains could have been created through transfer during David's attempt to help his son. This was not a minor technical disagreement. It went to the heart of the case. If the bloodstains could not reliably establish that David had been standing near a shooting, then one of the prosecution's most important pieces of physical evidence became far less powerful. And then there was Robert Stites. By the third trial, his earlier role and credentials had become a major issue. Later legal proceedings described serious problems with his qualifications and testimony, and Stites testified about his earlier involvement. The case was beginning to look very different. The question was no longer, how can prosecutors prove David did it? The question had become, how much of the original case can actually survive scrutiny? And that question was about to be tested in a courtroom one final time. In 2013, David Cam went on trial for the third time. By now, he had spent approximately 13 years in custody. His life had changed dramatically. The man who entered the criminal justice system in 2000 was no longer the same man standing before the jury. He had lost his wife. He had lost his children. He had lost his career. And he had spent more than a decade behind bars while maintaining that he had not killed his family. The third trial was held in Boone County because of extensive pretrial publicity surrounding the case. This time, the defense was determined to force the evidence itself to take center stage. Not rumors, not character attacks, not speculation. Evidence. The defense challenged the bloodstain interpretation. They presented forensic testimony about how blood could have transferred onto David's shirt. They pointed to evidence connecting Charles Boney to the crime scene. they challenged Boney's account of what had happened, and they argued that the physical evidence did not support the prosecution's theory that David and Boney had carried out a murder conspiracy. The courtroom was now dealing with a completely different level of forensic scrutiny. The bloodstains were no longer simply being presented as proof. They were being questioned. How many stains were there? What did their shape actually show? Could the same pattern be created through transfer? What assumptions had investigators made? What did the physical evidence actually establish? These questions mattered because forensic evidence can sound absolute when it is presented with confidence. But confidence is not the same thing as certainty. And in David Cam's case, the defense argued that the original interpretation had been given more weight than the physical evidence could support. The sweatshirt also remained central. Its DNA connection to Boney provided the defense with an alternative explanation for the crime scene. Boney himself had already been convicted for his role in the murders, and his accounts of what happened had changed. The prosecution still argued that Boney had acted with David. The defense argued that Boney's connection to the scene pointed away from David. The jury now had to decide. After years of trials, appeals, forensic disputes, competing theories, and enormous publicity, the question came down to 12 jurors. Was the prosecution able to prove David Cam committed these murders? Not whether he looked suspicious. Not whether his marriage had problems. Not whether investigators believed he was capable of doing it. Could they prove it? That distinction would determine the fate of a man who had already spent 13 years in prison. And on October 24th, 2013, the jury finally returned its answer. The courtroom had been waiting for this moment for 13 years. David Cam had already heard the word guilty twice. He had already watched his life disappear behind prison walls. He had already learned what it felt like to be convicted of killing the people he loved most. Now he was sitting through his third trial. And this time, the jury had a different question to answer. After hearing the evidence, the jurors deliberated for about 10 hours over 3 days. Then they returned to the courtroom. David waited. The verdict was read. Not guilty. On all 3 murder counts. David Cam was free. After spending approximately 13 years in custody, he walked out of the courthouse that same day. The moment was emotional. David cried. His family cried. Supporters cried. Because this was not simply the end of a trial. It was the end of a 13-year fight. But there was something heartbreaking about the victory. David could walk out of prison. He could reclaim his freedom. He could rebuild his life. But he could not get his family back. Kim was still dead. Brad was still dead. Jill was still dead. No verdict could change that. No courtroom could return the years David had lost. And no acquittal could erase what had happened to him. The case had started with a triple murder. It had turned into a prosecution of the grieving father. Then it had become a battle over bloodstain interpretation. Then a second suspect emerged. Then the prosecution changed theories. Then David was convicted again. Then the second conviction was overturned. Then came the third trial. And finally, after 13 years, the jury said the prosecution had not proved David Cam guilty. But there was still one question hanging over the entire story. If David did not kill his family, what exactly had happened that night? And what role had Charles Boney actually played? That question had not disappeared. In fact, the evidence surrounding Boney would become one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case. Because the strange sweatshirt had not been the only connection. There was also the palm print, the DNA, and a convicted man whose own accounts of the night would continue to change. David was free. But the story of who killed his family was not over. Charles Boney was not simply a theory. He was convicted for his role in the murders. Evidence connected him to the crime scene, including DNA associated with the sweatshirt and a palm print found on the family's vehicle. And that is what makes the case so difficult to understand. For years, investigators had been trying to explain David Cam's connection to the murders. But another man's physical connection to the scene became increasingly difficult to ignore. The sweatshirt was particularly important. It had been found at the crime scene. It was not David's. The DNA profile from it eventually led investigators to Boney. And Boney admitted that the sweatshirt had belonged to him, although he claimed he had given it away before the murders. That explanation created another question. If Boney had given the sweatshirt away, how did it end up at the Cam crime scene? There was no simple answer. Then came the palm print. Investigators connected Boney to a print found on the family's vehicle. Now there were multiple pieces of evidence pointing toward his presence. And there was more. During the third trial, the defense presented evidence involving biological material associated with Kim Cam and Boney that supported its argument that there had been a struggle. but the prosecution and defense disagreed sharply about what the evidence meant. That distinction is important, because in a complicated forensic case, evidence does not always tell its own story. People interpret it. They build timelines around it. They create theories around it. And sometimes the same physical evidence can become the foundation for completely different narratives. That is exactly what happened in David Cam's case. For years, prosecutors had built a narrative around David. Then the evidence surrounding Boney forced the story to become more complicated. And the more complicated the evidence became, the harder it was to reduce the case to a single, simple explanation. David Cam's acquittal did not mean every mystery surrounding the murders disappeared. It meant the jury did not find the prosecution had proven David guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That distinction matters, because a courtroom is not supposed to decide who seems suspicious. It is supposed to decide whether the evidence proves the charge. And after 3 trials, the final jury concluded that the prosecution had not met that burden. David walked free. Boney remained convicted. And the Cam case became a powerful example of what can happen when an investigation becomes dominated by a theory. And later, evidence forces that theory to be reconsidered. But there was another layer to the story. The case did not end when David walked out of the courthouse. It moved into another arena. The courtroom became a place where the actions of investigators, prosecutors, and forensic witnesses themselves would be examined, and David wanted answers. Freedom does not automatically restore a life. When David Cam walked out of the courthouse in 2013, he was free. But freedom could not give him back the years he had spent behind bars. It could not bring back his wife. It could not bring back Brad. It could not bring back Jill. And it could not restore the life he had expected to live. The legal battle continued after the criminal case. Cam filed civil litigation against investigators, prosecutors, and others involved in the prosecution, alleging constitutional and other violations. Some claims were dismissed or faced immunity barriers, and the civil litigation became another long legal chapter rather than a simple final victory. That part of the story is important because it shows something audiences often miss about wrongful conviction cases. A not guilty verdict is not a time machine. It does not erase prison records. It does not restore a career. It does not replace a lost childhood. It does not return a dead child to his parents, and it does not make 13 years disappear. David had entered the system as a father and former police officer. He came out after years of being publicly associated with the deaths of his own family. But the case had also exposed something much bigger than one man's tragedy. It showed how powerful a single forensic interpretation can become. It showed how a suspect can become the center of an investigation before every alternative explanation has been fully explored. It showed how evidence can be interpreted differently by different experts. And it showed why courts must carefully distinguish between evidence and conclusions drawn from that evidence. The bloodstain evidence became a major point of controversy. The sweatshirt became a symbol of the evidence that had initially failed to identify a suspect, but later became central to the case against Boney. And the 2 overturned convictions demonstrated another critical lesson. A conviction is not necessarily the final word. Appeals exist because trials can go wrong. Evidence can be admitted improperly. Juries can hear information that should not have been presented. And when those errors materially affect a case, convictions can be overturned. David Cam experienced that process twice. The first conviction was reversed. The second conviction was reversed. The third trial ended with acquittal. 3 trials, 13 years. One family that could never be restored. And a criminal case that became a national example of the danger of investigative tunnel vision and contested forensic evidence. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story is how different the case looks depending on where you begin. If you begin with the blood on David's shirt, he looks suspicious. If you begin with the sweatshirt, DNA, and palm print connected to Boney, the case looks completely different. If you begin with the 2 overturned convictions, you see a justice system correcting serious trial errors. And if you begin with the murders themselves, you see a family whose lives were destroyed long before the courtroom battle ever began. That is why this story has remained so compelling. Because the question was never just, who killed Kim, Brad, and Jill Cam? The deeper question became, how much evidence does it take before a theory becomes accepted as truth? And what happens when that theory is wrong? The David Cam case does not end with a simple hero and villain story. And that is exactly why it deserves to be told carefully. A wife and 2 children were murdered. A grieving father became a suspect. A bloodstain interpretation became a major part of the case against him. He was convicted. That conviction was overturned. A new suspect emerged through DNA evidence associated with a sweatshirt. A second prosecution theory developed. David was convicted again. That conviction was overturned. Then came the third trial. And finally, the jury found him not guilty. Those are the essential facts. But beneath them is a larger lesson about the criminal justice system. Evidence matters. But the way people interpret evidence matters too. A tiny blood stain can be described as a critical forensic clue. Another expert can look at the same stain and say it may have another explanation. A piece of clothing can sit in an evidence locker for years. A DNA profile can remain unidentified until someone finally connects it to a person. And once investigators become convinced they know what happened, every new piece of information can be viewed through that existing theory. That is the danger of tunnel vision. It does not require every investigator to be corrupt. It does not require every prosecutor to be dishonest. It can happen because people are human. Once a theory feels convincing, evidence that supports it can seem more important. Evidence that contradicts it can seem less important. And in a murder case, where the pressure to find an answer is enormous, that psychological effect can become extremely powerful. The Cam case is also a reminder that forensic science is not magic. DNA can be extraordinarily powerful. But DNA tells investigators about biological material. It does not automatically tell them the entire story of what happened. Bloodstain patterns can provide useful information. But interpreting a pattern requires expertise, methodology, and careful consideration of alternative explanations. A fingerprint can connect a person to an object or location, but investigators still have to determine when and why that person was there. Every piece of evidence needs context, and every theory needs to survive challenge. For David Cam, that challenge took 13 years. On October 24th, 2013, after 3 murder trials, the jury finally found him not guilty. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, but he did not walk out with the life he had lost. He walked out carrying the memory of a wife and 2 children who would never see him again. And that may be the most painful truth in this entire story. The justice system can correct a conviction. It can reverse a judgment. It can order a new trial. A jury can say not guilty. But none of those things can undo a murder. None can return a child. None can restore a marriage. None can give 13 lost years back. David Cam spent those years fighting to prove that the story told about him was not the truth. And after 3 trials, the final jury agreed that the state had not proved he was guilty. His story remains a warning, not simply about wrongful convictions, but about the enormous responsibility that comes with interpreting evidence. Because when a murder happens, investigators are searching for an answer. And sometimes the most dangerous moment in an investigation is when they believe they have already found one. David Cam came home one night expecting to see his family. Instead, he found 3 people he loved murdered. Then he became the suspect. Then the defendant. Then a convicted murderer. Then, after 2 overturned convictions and 13 years behind bars, a free man. The sweatshirt that once seemed like a forgotten piece of evidence became a path toward another suspect. The bloodstains that prosecutors believed helped establish David's guilt became one of the most disputed forensic elements in the case. And the courtroom eventually forced the story to be examined again. 3 trials later, the answer was finally clear in one crucial respect. David Cam was not found guilty. He was found not guilty. And sometimes, in the American justice system, the difference between those 2 words is the difference between losing the rest of your life in prison and finally walking outside again. But the murders of Kim, Brad, and Jill Cam remain the reason this story exists. Their lives, not the courtroom drama, are where the story began. And they should never become just characters in a true crime mystery. They were a wife, a son, a daughter, a family. And on one September night in Indiana, their lives were taken. What followed was 13 years of suspicion, trials, appeals, disputed forensic evidence, and a fight over what the evidence actually meant. In the end, the case became something much larger than a murder prosecution. It became a reminder that justice is not simply about finding someone to blame. It is about getting the truth right. And when the evidence is complicated, getting the truth right may take much longer than anyone expects.